This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joe Filliol, back with a great discussion today with Peter Leo, who holds the role of endurance training scientist at Australian Cycling, the national federation in Australia, and is also a coach for the World Tour cycling team Jayco Alula. I first met Peter back in 2015 at a conference, World Triathlon, held at INSEP in Paris, where I was giving a talk on Simon Whitfield's career, which I can link to below. It's on YouTube. I remember meeting Peter there, and since then watching his transition from really a student to a researcher with his long-term analysis of U23 cycling teams, to sports scientist and now coach, which is a difficult transition that few practitioners successfully make in their careers. So it's a great discussion about Peter's research interests, how he applies this to his coaching and practical work in different contexts. We touch on durability, a popular topic in cycling, and how that might apply to triathlon. How training has changed over time and his insights post-pandemic. What young cyclists are doing that's impacting the development and prominence of successful young cyclists, and why that's not necessarily happening in triathlon. What different training approaches overall and implications for athlete development. How he balances his roles as part of a national federation with his work in the professional cycling team, and the synergies there, which are very interesting. We talk about the data analysis tools he uses and how he shares that information across teams and makes a performance impact, and why that doesn't happen in triathlon. Before going on into the discussion with Peter, as I want to do, have a little leadership interlude of something that came up recently that I saw. And that's strategic plans that are released by various organizations. It was really interesting to read what's put out in the public domain. I notice in these cases sort of the generic nature of these documents and how they're not that distinguishable from the previous versions. I think in many cases seem to be like wish lists of what they want to happen, but really very light on details of how they would make any of these goals happen. And it recalls a quote that I've used in various presentations, and that's culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's a quote by business leader Peter Drucker. And it recalls a blog by Jason Fried of a company called 37 Signals that has a product called Basecamp, which is great for organizing and communication of businesses, but I've also used it with various organizations I've worked with. And it goes on this culture topic, which is very popular to think about in sport as well. And the blog article is called "Company Culture is the Last 50 Days." And it goes on, there's nothing complicated about company culture. Culture simply happens. It's emergent behavior. There's nothing to do. It just is. A company's culture is a 50-day moving average. It's what you've been collectively doing as a company over the last 50 days. How do you treat people? Who have you hired or fired, and why? What do you do when people are stressed out? How do you help people? How do you critique each other? How do you share? How do you help people who are stuck? Where's the bar on quality? How do you support customers? In this case, maybe athletes or coaches. How do you close deals? What have you let go on too long? What have you celebrated? What have you let slide? How honest have you been with each other and yourself? It's all that and a zillion other things, but it's all stuff that's actually happened, not lists of things you wish had happened or declare would happen in some ideal setting. Much of it is interpersonal, expressed both inside and outside the organization. It goes on to say, why 50 days? It's enough time for patterns to emerge, yet malleable enough to be current and honest. One day or even a couple of weeks isn't enough to stand for culture. A series of moments tied together loosely by near-term time isn't enough to establish what it's really like somewhere. We can all be on our best behavior for a little while, but the longer while tells the truth. Culture is the non-fiction story of an organization. It writes itself. And this resonated because I see it in a lot of organizations. There are all these values and words that are expressed, and just the difference between what's actually happening, what behaviors actually exist, how people treat each other, and whether the goals of the organization are front and center, or perhaps getting stuck in distraction and irrelevance as is commonplace. And coming back to that quote, if the dominant culture doesn't support the strategy, then, well, the strategy is redundant and it won't be successful. And finally, before we get into the discussion with Peter, support the podcast. You can support future podcasts by signing up for one-to-one coaching with me. The ideal athlete are those who already experienced in the sport, perhaps been competing for a while and wanting to take their performance to the next level. And really, my approach is cutting through the complications and finding a simple, effective approach, the same as I've used with my elite athletes in squad over the last 20 years. Also possible to engage in consulting for athletes not looking for coaching yet, but program reviews or specific topics. And finally, for coaches looking for mentorship, taking on my experiences and helping them improve their coaching practice. Finally, you can also join me in person for a camp in the Loire Valley in Northwest France in May or June, and we're possibly going to have a September date this year as well. So get in touch about that if you want to spend a full week together, either training, discussion, good food and company, and an opportunity for learning in all things high performance in triathlon. Finally, support the podcast by signing up for the Real Coaching Substack, subscribing and leaving comments, reviews, sharing this interview with someone who might find it valuable. And really, that's our model, value for value. Now, onwards to the discussion with Peter. Before we start into who you are, Peter, where are you in the world and what have you been up to today?
I'm based in Austria at the moment, in Innsbruck, in the middle of the European Alps. It's quite a rainy day today, so I didn't do much in the morning, and let's prepare for this podcast.
So on your research gate, you have this expression, and I wanted to ask you about it. Science Kardashian with the Kardashian index 8.73. So what does this mean?
Yeah, it's actually a bit of a parody. I don't take myself too serious at some point, and I just don't think that all the academic titles and so on don't need always to be mentioned. So I said, I'll do something funny. And there's actually an article about, at that time where Twitter, now X, was really a big thing. There have been some eminent researchers who have published hundreds of papers, but they actually had a very small amount of followers. So they came up with an index that actually is just the ratio between your published and cited papers to the Twitter followers ratio. So everything literally below a ratio of 5.0, you're very credible scientist, you're well established, and you're very senior and accomplished. And everything above 5, you're just more like a pro science boy. And I'm still in the pro science field, so that's right. The background story of that.
I was recalling when we first connected, and my mind went back to Paris 15. I think it was World Triathlon that initiated a triathlon conference, and they only had a few, which is a shame because I think it was really good. But I was there. I was asked to speak about Simon Whitfield's career, the first gold medalist in triathlon. And I remember we spoke after my talk and during the conference. That was a long time ago. So what have you been up to since then? And maybe we can talk about a bit of your background for people that don't know you and, leading into where you are today.
Yeah, funny you say that, because that was literally the you have in Training Peaks, you have a breakthrough session. And I would say in my pathway, sports science pathway, that was probably a breakthrough moment. As you say, like it was for me, at that time, I was just a bachelor student, just doing my undergrads and just trying to learn and absorb all of these. And I was actually looking up all to you, and I think there was Darren Smith doing a presentation, and Inigo and Jamie Stanley and Paul B. Larson. So all the big names in triathlon and endurance sport. Jan Lemur was there as well. They were all presenting, and I was just over it and got so excited about it. And it was, I would say at that time, quite inspirational as well for me to show a pathway of where you actually can be or want to be. So I remember I can still send you the photo we took together. And it was a funny moment where I met Inigo. Can you imagine? I met Inigo and I bought his book, The Application of Endurance Training. And he signed it personally. And then I remember I asked him and said, once I want to do a PhD, you want to be my supervisor? And the only thing Inigo answered at that time was, Peter, finish your bachelor first. So, and it was this funny thing because even later on, I met Jamie Stanley in Australia as he was basically in the role I had with the Australian cyclists before. It was also our first meeting there at the Triathlon Science Conference. So, yeah, I went on and finished my bachelor, did my master's, and went to the military for a while and be more like an exercise scientist for the Austrian Armed Forces. Then the pandemic came, and I was pretty much always already involved in helping under 23 cyclists to improve. And actually, I was always wanted to work in triathlon, but I ended up working more in cycling. And I started with a continental team in Austria, Tyrol KTM team, which was just in Europe like a development program for young cyclists, international cyclists to train. So I really could start working with them and help transition them to the World Tour. But I got so many questions on, their training, understanding cycling, racing demands and all this that I actually said, well, I need to do like a research project out of it. So this is how I got to actually, all my PhD work. And then I remember I found out Inigo's email and I messaged him with the topic. And I asked him, Inigo, this is my topic. You want to be part of it? And all he replied is, I'm in. And so that was actually the start of it. And it went on and on.
So Inigo, for people that don't know, who is Inigo?
So Inigo Mujica, it's not Inigo San Milan.
Yeah.
It's Inigo Mujica. Small difference, or actually quite a big difference. They're both Basque, but So now I worked with Inigo Mujica, and I think Inigo has been a pretty well accomplished scientist. He has been working in multiple endurance sport disciplines, swimming and triathlon, but also cycling. So I think he's one of the most heavily cited sports scientists, applied sports scientists in the world. He was actually my supervisor. He also actually has been a high performance coach. He coached Ano Emura for the Spanish Olympian, triathlon Olympian, and the Llanos brothers, Hector and Eneco. And also he worked with Fred Vernu, Spanish swim coach, with Mirera Bemonte they won also Olympic gold in Rio at that time. I think he has been advising Gwen Jorgensen and her coach as well. So we don't need to say much about Inigo, but he has been a pretty challenging supervisor. I think he saw my he doesn't supervise many students, what I actually found out then. And he was basically treating me like an athlete. The first year was just horrible. Like I was thinking actually about giving up. He just introduced such a high standard of quality he accepted. And I remember the first article I sent him, the draft articles, he just didn't even read and said, "Oh, no, improve. But there was some point where and I felt after looking or reflecting about it, it's just he actually wanted to test me how bad I wanted it, and if it's just all like hot air or if I really want to go for it. And I think he found this really inner trigger for me. And I think that was quite influential for me being a young junior scientist and be able to have such a strong mentor and leader in this direction.
He, as you say, is a prolific speaker and author or editor of the book, which we'll link to later, which I have the first edition. There's a second edition, I think, now. But you've talked about your PhD project in other podcasts, which I'll link to as well. But it was a long-term study of the physiological and performance characteristics of this U23 team. But how did you get access to work with this team? Like how did that work? In terms of, because of course you need data to study, you need a good training history to understand. I mean, it's probably the challenge with sports science, isn't it, of like getting access to that kind of data, which is totally different than university students type thing that you might do a short-term intervention, but this long-term stuff is super interesting. So how did you get access, and how did that work?
Yeah. I was somehow lucky because I just finished my master, and then Innsbruck basically was confirmed to host the World Championships in cycling back in 2018. And then in 2017, obviously there was still the team time trial as a kind of, it was the last edition in Innsbruck where the World Tour teams actually competed for the team time trial. After Innsbruck, it changed into a mixed time trial now. But that was the last edition, and then obviously this Tirol KTM team was the hosting team in Tyrol, and they were kind of a bit of ambassadors. And they made a radical shift. Before, they pretty much were these, like, this from third league football clubs were just retired pros, just have a ride on the UCI continental level and some good money. And they wanted to just do a really transition to more like junior development and under 23 development, and so they were actually looking for more performance support. And I came in through a sponsor because I was at that time working for a private clinic as a physiologist, and they became sponsor. And they say, "Hey, before we give you money, we can offer you Peter." And they were actually a bit skeptical at the beginning. It's like, "Oh yeah, but he was not even a cyclist. He was a triathlete. Like, how can this guy actually help us?" And I honestly had to really upskill and understand cycling. It's different than just watching on Eurosport and you think you are the couch peloton and you understand it. It's pretty different. And even you always see the World Tour, but it's under 23 racing and continental level racing is very different to the World Tour, and the requirements are quite different. And so actually I started working with them. I helped improving the training, and it started basically just with more like applied work. But the question came over and over, and I came to a point where I just said, well, I can now decide if I just want to be on this level and keep continuing, or I really step up and understand better and ask those questions, what really trigger me. And I think they were pretty open to that suggestion. And then, I presented this to actually 2 universities. This first university, I don't want to mention the name, but they rejected it and said, "Nah, we don't want to get involved into cycling. It's bad name and it's not worth it." And it was quite a bit of a setback. But the second University of Innsbruck, with Professor Lovely, he gave me that kind of right. And he was actually a former PhD student of Benjamin Levin, who was basically the inventor of Live High, Train High. So he had quite of this international background. He came from Dallas, so he was US. And he immediately understood that he doesn't know enough about cycling. So that's why then Inigo came in as a really strong co-supervisor. That's how very often you have 2. You have a primary supervisor who helps you with the admin, and a secondary supervisor who just knows also about your topic really well. And this is how we set it up. And then it was pretty much a 5-year project. I think I was just lucky, other than my other colleagues who also pursued a PhD, that I could assess most of my data before actually the lockdown. And that was for me quite a winning move. I would say now, looking back with COVID, actually the pandemic was really good for myself because I had just time to write it. And if I would look at it now, it's so hard to find time to do this. But at that time, with the pandemic and the lockdowns, you were almost forced on your computer to write it and get it done. So that helped me a lot. And then, I finished it and then the journey went on.
So when you're gonna make an analysis, and we'll get into the roles you're doing now, but this is interesting. This is like the first experience you had like that, I think. Where do you start? So I mean, was the team using Training Peaks or another online tool? Like, how do you move up from individual analysis to to maybe a group, or what tools did you use, or what methods do you use to sort of pull out either trends or what you can learn from? What was your process like?
Yeah, you were right. I mean, at that time, 2017, 2018, Training Peaks was pretty strong in the best years, I would say. Everyone had Training Peaks, at least in the World Tour. Not everyone had Training Peaks at this team. So I came in and introduced everyone, got Training Peaks account. It was just attached to a coach account. We were just gathering all that historic information, first of all, before we actually go into doing any prospective work. We actually just looked at retrospective. What can we understand from the past? I think that was quite important, and say, okay, where did these under 23 cyclists come from? What was their background? How many years did they spend on the bike? Or did we actually had some talent that actually did another sport? And there have been some really good examples in this team. Now, I think I can mention this name because this is probably the most famous one now who made the step to the World Tour, which was Florian Lipovic. Yesterday he came top 5 in Paris-Nice, and he was a biathlete. And he came to the team actually by the link with Dan Loran. And Dan said, look at this guy, he's so good. He was actually living nearby Innsbruck. So I had him in the lab. And, with 2,000 kilometers of cycling, he had a VO2 of above 85 milliliters per kilogram of body mass, And you just have this natural talent coming in. And we literally say, well, when he learns to ride a bike and when he learns how to play the tactics, this guy can be world class. We know it by then. And then the learning curve, for example, the learning curve was such a talent compared to someone who took up cycling with 12 or 13 already. It was so exponential. Like the learning, even from race to race, you saw this big improvement in understanding of his tactics and understanding how he saves energy, because he had this huge engine. He was basically also doing the whole chop off, he was leading the whole peloton in these races. But yeah, it was really good to see that cross talent transfer in cycling works really well. And it's not, we are not the only example who proved that. It's like there are multiple other examples where even from triathlon, Ivan Romeo is now with Movistar. He's been, he's been quite impressive now in the world. I think in Tour Down Under, he won his first World Tour stage race. So yeah, it just shows over and over.
So when you've got access, you get everyone on the Training Peaks. The coaches of the team are using Training Peaks, or so how do you sort of pull that out, or what do you said retroactively you're looking at it. So you're doing in the dashboard, are you making charts, or are you extracting that data into something else? And like, talk us through the process of what that looked like. How do you pull out either trends, or what are you looking for? How do you find those insights that potentially can lead to them? And I guess in this case you're both studying what was being done, but then you also mentioned you were thinking, like, how do you make a positive impact on what they might do moving forward, like from taking
Correct.
those lessons out. So just walk through that.
I think there's a big difference between a day-to-day analysis, what you do as a coach, and like a really scientific analysis, what you do as a group, for a group, and also quite with your standards. And I think that's something that's very often mixed up. As a coach with a day-to-day, approach, I think Training Peaks is still a good tool to do. You have because you look at your hours, you look at the TSS. I mean, it's far from perfect, but it's a measure. So I think it works really well for the day-to-day coaching process. Well, if you want to do a scientific analysis, Training Peaks is pretty much limited. You cannot really use Training Peaks to do that. So what we actually did is we exported those fit files who are saved in Training Peaks. And we actually we were doing the same, because this was actually challenged by my supervisor. Like, yeah, you use 2 commercial products, the most famous one linked to Training Peaks is WKO4 at that time, now 5. So obviously there was this good auto synchronization where you just you pull out those fit files from Training Peaks, you load them into WKO5, and there you can either customize charts there, you can use their workout libraries and dashboards, and it's really good. It was a first way of having a deeper look into what does a fit file contain. So a fit file is just a raw data format of a head unit export, like a Garmin or so, what you get. And then because it was so strongly linked to Training Peaks, the supervisor said you need something more independent as well, just to prove your concept. So I just did the same with Golden Cheetah. So these were the two most common, most famous tools of analysis. I think it went up quite a while to do that, but the problem is the more I got the data, the slower my computer became, because you have to load all these fit files. Imagine you have 20 riders for 5 seasons, and you get a fit file export of almost 1,000 endurance hours with 25 to 30,000 kilometers. These are huge files. So my first computer, basically, that was the reason he died. So I ended up just learning how to code with R and Python, and there is some really good extent. I mean, I had the time at that time, and especially with the power profile, Mike Bukowitz was really a great help because he's really into coding, and he supported me a lot. And there's this Golden Cheetah GitHub club, I felt really, really more like an IT student at that time with the data analysis than a scientist. But it was required to analyze all this field data. So we had to customize some of this stuff for the research we did. But I think Golden Cheetah and WKO was a great starting point for us to start looking at the data.
And in your PhD project, I mean, the couple of the themes that come out that have been discussed kind of a lot since then are, of course, power profiling and understanding what characteristics the athletes have. But I think another one that comes through, which I don't know if you mention it exactly, but this concept of durability, which has been really discussed a lot since then, I think. And I don't know if yours was a kickoff of this discussion,
and
but
honestly, I have to give, it was actually, who brought me to durability. And I think there was actually really good competition when you look. I think it's really important to understand the timeline of how this whole durability or fatigue resistance was created. I think it's nothing new at all. It's just as always, like, this in science or anyway in training nomenclature, it gets a new name, it gets super attractive. There have been groups even in the 1990 years who looked at the decline in time trial capacity and so on. So it is nothing new. However, an article that really triggered me in the way of understanding and preparing for it was Neil Dwylson, when he prepared Will Barter for the World Tour. At that time, he was with CCC, and then I think he went pro with Movistar at that time. And there's actually a Training Peaks article on it, the making of a World Tour rider, I think. And that article and what he prescribed in there was basically coming from a coaching anecdote, but it was so catchy and so interesting. And I said, there's something more in there. So we started quite explorative and said, well, look, there's something about this accumulated work thing, So we actually, for Science and Cycling Conference in 2020, we prepared this. But then the pandemic came, so we were not able to actually present it. So then we went actually on and said, well, now we have more time, we can take a deeper look. And we had this race of the multi-stage race Tour of the Alps, where this is like a 2-point pro race. and most World Tour teams do this as a preparation for the Giro d'Italia. And the team, because it was the hosting country, got a wild card to participate in there. So that was our unique opportunity to compare ourselves against the Chris Froome at that time and Rafa Majka and all these really world-class climbers. And, there was this collaboration with Androni from the Pro Tour team, the Italian team, and Bora Hansgrohe and Bahrain and Tirol KTM cycling team, who then actually joined and said, let's look at the group difference between under 23 World Tour riders, but even then make a distinction about the rider types. And that's what we found, obviously, that, they have all the same fresh power profile, really. But if you look more in the relative power profile or the power profile after these accumulated workloads, the different ones, this is like a whole different topic, And interestingly, at the same time, Dyer Sanders and Teun van Erp with Rob Lamperts did very, very similar work with the DSN group, or now at that time the Sunweb group. And literally, we submitted at the same time, and the papers came out within one month of difference, with basically backing out, confirming each other's result. So in research, that actually, if two groups independently find the same trend, this is the most powerful evidence you can actually get, So this is how it all started. And then I think, it just went on from this. Then the Spanish group with Manu Mateo and Barranco and Pedro Valenzuela, they joined. So it was actually a really good collaborative approach on this. And I would say there was competition between those groups as well. And I think that competition helped to move on the field. My colleague James Bragg then added his PhD onto my PhD, and we could use most of this data to even investigate with new questions. So that was a really cool process and time for us to get a better understanding. And I think it's still not finished. We think what we found, like, okay, first of all, we were all talking about this accumulated fatigue. Very quickly we realized when we did some more work matched intensity that, if we talk about a really well-trained World Tour cyclist, the accumulation of kilojoules only is not a trigger at all. Instead, we found that actually when they really accumulate those kilojoules in really low intensity, everything below the first lactate threshold, there is actually no decline at all. There's actually, even later on, they have better power profile because their legs open up or whatever reason. And then we added some really controlled trials where we added either a fixed amount of intensity spent at a certain kilojoules, or we added like a race simulation. And then very quickly we found, it's actually the accumulation in a certain intensity that really triggers the decline in power output. So that was the next step. So it's everything that basically is about your FTP. The kilojoules accumulate above your FTP is a very, very strong trigger of your fatigue resistance. And then the next thing was that the long power outputs from 5 minutes onwards are actually not really affected by fatigue resistance or by this accumulated workloads. It's actually the short duration power outputs, like sprints, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I think those are the most distinctive durations where durability really affects the power output. And so, you went on and on and on. And it's a really interesting topic, I would say.
Indeed, and it makes me think, well, maybe we should pause. Like, what is durability for somebody's listening to this and is familiar maybe with the name because it's been out there if you're following sports science, but what is durability and why is it important?
Durability, I would say, is a coin term and it's definitely not, there is no single factor, it's multifactorial. Because there's a lot of things that play into fatigue resistance or this kind of durability. It's literally, you can say, durability can be defined as the repeated ability of produce high intensity power outputs. Like Steven Seiler used this or coined the term of high power output repeatability. You can also use that term, So it goes all in this kind of, or Andy Jones literally did a narrative review on physiological resilience. So that's the problem in sports science, that certain author groups coin different terms, but they all really mean the same. Same with the threshold, like you can open up a can of worms with lactate threshold concepts and you find 20 of them, and each has his right and background, but it's just more about this context. So this durability element, I think, is when you look at the different endurance performance determinants, like you have your VO2 max, you have your utilization of your VO2 max, so basically the fraction of your threshold, you have your economy of efficiency of movement, then you have your anaerobic reserves. So this is the primary model, but it's all really underpinned by how does this actually involve during accumulated work or fatigue or during prolonged endurance exercise. And that has been actually missing a bit in this initial endurance framework. So now with this physiological resilience, you have that term that is just say, well, how good is your repeatability? You can have the best lap numbers, you can have the best, fresh power profile, but if you cannot repeat it or if you cannot replicate it, it's useless for you for endurance sport. And that's what we very often see, not only in cycling, we also see it in triathlon. Not necessarily the athletes with the fastest split are at the end winning triathlons. It's more about the complexity of how these determinants are working together under a very, very specific task. So you cannot isolate them. And I think that's quite tricky, even for specialists to get their head around, because we want to have this black and white answer, but it isn't. It isn't,
It's interesting. So, my interpretation is that you could do a power profile test or series of tests fresh, but then could you replicate that after having done a certain amount of work, right? And I suppose the obvious kind of question is, what does this mean for training? So we know that, I guess I'll extrapolate from what I was just thinking. Well, some people, they can't replicate their power profile or they can't produce the required power under a certain amount of fatigue. And that's the differentiator. I mean, we probably can think of this anecdotally about in training, with a certain chronic load. I mean, for me, that's where I see the difference in the quality of the athlete is ability to produce quality training under high chronic load. Like that's a huge longitudinal differentiator for me. But what does it mean for training? So this topic is, as you say, it's been studied and identified, and we can see the importance. How do we train durability? What do we need to do differently than we might have done in the past if we're thinking about this as an important characteristic? And I do want to apply it to triathlon as well, because it's probably equally important in triathlon. You could maybe make the case, well, what is running off the bike? Do you need a certain amount of durability to run your potential off the bike, for example? But what does it mean for training? What did you discover? How would you do things differently in training, having identified this as an important characteristic?
I think, honestly, a very, very strong deterministic of durability is actually glycogen replenishment, or basically glycogen intake. I think that this is where this whole carbohydrate metabolism, fuel for the work required, is really kicking in. So it's actually massively limited to your carbohydrate intake ability. That's what we really found, and this is also what you see now changing with the prescription or with the recommendations they have made even 10 years ago, and now it's literally double of it. That also explains why they are more. They can replicate a lot more of these high-intensity workloads. So I think that there is actually a really strong nutritional effect to that durability element. I think from a training perspective per se, it's not an overnight success. It's not like a high-intensity training intervention where you almost after 2 to 3 sessions you feel a difference. I think the durability is slowly evolving, and it's exactly what you said. It's about this chronic loading. Progressive chronic loading is the strongest predictor of durability. So there is no shortcuts on durability. You need to do the work required. You need to get. So what we see interestingly now is in under 23, it's a new concept and it's pretty different to what I've seen before the pandemic. So the pandemic, interestingly, for cycling was a big switch in terms of how young involving cyclists train. So before there was always this idea, let's really slowly progress their training each year, like 50 to 100 hours more. And you know that then by the end of the fourth year, they're close to this 900, 950 hours barrier of endurance hours. Completely different now. What we see is first year under 23, almost at 850 to some of even 1,000 hours. So what happens is that those good talent or the strong riders, and that's a question of survival of the fittest, but the ones who make it, they can ramp up their training really, really fast in terms of hours, even in 2 to 3 years. And what's interesting then is when they peak with the annual hours, where they then just say, well, we hit the sweet spot and there is actually no much gain for more hours. What happens is that actually they slightly reduce the hours, but they got so much more room in their training volume, they could proportionally then just go harder. So that's just mean their workload for the same hour goes up, you know, so they, rather than riding at 200 watts, they can now ride at 250 watts because they just got this engine room ready to fill it up with workload. And it's a really powerful concept because that completely smashes the 10,000 hour rule or longitudinal development. It actually is really down to 3 to 5 years maximum. So it goes a lot faster than we initially thought. That's what actually separates between the guy who makes it and the guy who doesn't make it, because we investigated those who didn't make it, and those who didn't make it had issues with that aggressive loading. They could not be loaded, and you know, they had very similar fresh power profile, very similar lab characteristics. So there was actually in the performance physiology not a real difference. But the difference was actually in the applied training, how much load they could handle. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and even if you were super careful, they could never step up. And it's just, I think the real answer is the trainability of an individual is the answer to durability.
Right. So
how good trainable are you?
That is doing that work, that volume of work younger. Do you need a certain amount of trainability, or does that create the trainability or reinforce it?
Yeah, it's this is the question of nature versus nurture,
right?
You know, and I'm actually not sure, to be honest. I think still that for endurance cycling you need to have this nature, like just to tolerate these high volumes. I think that's why we emphasize way too much focus in all these testing numbers. We need to better understand about the train. We need to better study training history, and you know what are the effect curves of an athlete, what makes them better. And if you found that effect curve of an athlete, then you actually can translate, well, is it actually worth investing in this athlete, or does the effect curve never really turn on? And I know we are, at the moment, we are not yet there to answer these questions, but there will be a lot more clarity, I would say, in 2 to 3 years, where, you know, now all this AI coming into sport, you can just very, very quickly query that with machine learning algorithms, and they give you all that information. And that's now the new, I would say, the new time involvement of applied sports science, where you can just ask those questions and get immediate, very, very strong numeric evidence if this trend is actually worth to fulfill or not. So yeah, it's a very exciting time of at the moment.
So the old model, if I hear what you're saying, was a gradual progression in annual training volume, and then something changed, or you saw a change in the trend to increase the annual volume more quickly to where you might find that sweet spot, as you said. And presumably you have to manage the intensity, the quantity of intensity. You would have to manage that. But what changed? What prompted it? Was it the research that was coming out of groups like yours, or was it the pandemic of not being able to race, just being able to train a lot, or
Yeah, yeah.
that was
You
it?
hit the nail. I think honestly, the 2 years of pandemic made a massive difference to all these young kids because they had time all of a sudden to train a year with almost no racing, and you came out and you race after these years with an absolute, like it blew my mind because normally I was pretty meticulously following those names from other teams, and all of a sudden you don't have 5, you have 35, at the same level. So the density we got after the pandemic was surreal. They were popping out from each corner, and it's so hard. And yes, maybe it was the time where they could just invest into the training process that made a big shift. I think also the other thing is that they start training professionally way earlier. Like if you look now at an under 17 athlete, they already, they have a power meter. They train with power. They have a coach. Like the training got so much more professional at a younger age that already there, I think the progress starts. And I think, is it a good trend? I cannot say, but it's the trend what we see at the moment. And I think research is always relying on research here would be wrong, because research is always I think there's coach intuition about these trends and what a coach's eye see in a competition, but also when training with the boys. And this is how you inform your decision making in a high performance environment. It's nice then, obviously, when you have a research project or an applied research project that makes the numbers look good or makes the approach look good. But I think high performance never really relies on research. It's actually research relies on high performance. And then, yes, I think the only takeaway for high performance is that, you get confirmation from research. But very often what we do in high performance cannot even be answered by research. Let's be honest. I think especially individualization is a big thing at the moment now in sports science research, that it all comes like this whole sports science is actually coming obviously very strong from a medical study design with control groups, etc. But we all know that our athletes don't respond like groups, and
Right.
they don't respond like control versus intervention. The individual responses to training are super different. You can administer the same set of intervals and you get very, very mixed results. And I think this is where research cannot replace like coaching intuition and this element. So I think it's not one versus the other. Like I think there's some really good joint synergy, how you can use each other. But I think high performance still relies on really good coach intuition, coach knowledge, experience. And I think this is impossible to learn. It's just what you got. You cannot say, I'm visiting a class and then be a high performance coach. It just doesn't work. You need that exposure through years. And I saw it on myself, like when I started in 2018 and now through the exposure of 5 years more, it's just the way you see things now, even with at the same time available, it's just so different. So the quality assessment, what you can make from experience, this is irreplaceable. And so it's I think this is why the question is also simple. AI will never replace a coach, or I think it can help inform, make decision, but it will never replace a coach.
Well, there's so many interesting points that could come out of that. I mean, I would say, the ability to quickly analyze data and draw out insight is a potential real advantage of these models, where it's a shame because so much of what we see in the commercial space isn't that it's you look at Strava's implementation of AI is just noise. It's a nonsense, and there's a possibility for it. I'm sure it will improve, but the ability to analyze data is very interesting. But I want to draw in on that individualization idea, because I tend to agree that really resonates. How do we, because what you're talking about is, you do a study and you get sort of a group average. What happened in the study was the group, but what you really want to know is, were there individual responders that really responded to the whatever the protocol might be? Because that's what the coaching is going to be about, is figuring out for your athlete in front of you what might be the best intervention methodology that they might really respond to. They may be a high responder where you could apply the same thing to a different athlete and maybe they don't respond very much. And that's what you lose in the group averages, don't you? But so how do we dig into that? I mean, what ways do you use to find what might be the best intervention or protocol for an athlete, to dig into how they might be a responder? Is it coming from your research? Is it coming from observing training? Is it coming from competition performances? How do you unpick that process to do the individualization at a higher level?
Yeah, yeah. That's a good question. I asked this question myself a lot. And the way I came up with is use these athlete phenotypes a bit. I really like this from cycling. In cycling, you have these classic sprinter, time trialist, GC rider, all-rounder. So you have these cycling phenotypes, and each cycling phenotype can actually be really prescribed with some like peak bar output. Is a very good descriptor for a sprinter versus a time trialist versus a climber and an all-rounder. So you can use performance metrics like a power profile really well to differentiate those groups. And then what I think the important takeaway is, the training you have then to do for these individual groups with those different properties makes sense. Because let's take a sprinter versus a time trialist. If I do a sprinter, like let's say a set of 4 times 8 minutes, what does it actually help a sprinter? This is just not specific enough. So you actually probably what the sprinter needs to be doing with the high stochastic intermittent work, you got to look at, okay, what is, and then you come back to the competition demand and say, what is he actually needs to do? Well, he needs to ride, he needs to follow wheels, he needs to be efficient in the bunch, but then he needs to really bang it out. He needs to be able to sprint under fatigue. So obviously then you look for training that actually is suited to that, or sessions that are actually suited to that. And the same for a time trialist. Well, for time trialist, it's quite simple. It's that, well, this is the course, this is the length of time trial, this is the power output requirement. So let's portion this, and then there you go. So I think also there is a risk of make it too complicated, and actually it's not that complicated. And I remember you saying, and that's for me, that is very, very true what you always said. In triathlon, these coaches or opinion leaders that say you need to train at supra-maximal speed over your 10K race pace or 5K race pace. I tend to agree with you that this is actually, why does someone, when he runs 31 minutes on a 10K, why do they need to go or do kilometers at 240? This is so far away of actually the speeds they're running in their triathlon. It's better to just approach them by their race speed and their race pace, because this is what they can actually functionally use. So I think the bottom term for me is specificity matters. And by specificity, I mean, you need to understand what this athlete is capable in a competition. And this is something, a coach can assess, an experienced coach can assess pretty easily. An inexperienced coach probably needs more data for the same conclusion, So yeah, I think I tend to always come down on this. It's not black and white. You need context. But I think when you talk about high performance, racing is still the best testing, and racing gives us a lot of answers. There might not always be like a physiological or performance physiology answer. There might also be, let's take triathlon or let's take a crit race. There might also be like a skill component, a technical component that really, gives the athlete the lack of, or they're so technically limited, or they're so bad at cornering, or so bad at being on the wheel, that they waste so much extra energy that then this is actually a massive performance limiter for them. And or in cycling, for example, like you can be great uphill, but if you are afraid of going fast downhill, this is a massive limiter, like a really big limiter in the World Tour. And that, you will never be a winner if you never learn to descend fast and be safe on the bike as well. Like descending fast and be safe, two very different shoes. So I think it's pretty complex, I would say.
I mean, again, there's so many things that we could go there from this point, but I think stepping back just a little bit about this concept of how the training volume approach changed, the intensity changed, and COVID, and specificity and joining those up. And my observation in triathlon is I don't think the same revolution, if we can call it that, has happened post-COVID. What I see globally, I would say, is a high focus on specificity, because we can measure stuff. We can do crit sessions and stochastic training, but then not doing that chronic load. Prioritizing the short term, which I agree is really valuable, and that's changed a lot in the last 15 years in triathlon, both in short distance and long distance, but not necessarily doing that kind of volume, or not wanting. I mean, the classic error is you try to do both at the same time, right? You try to do a high intensity, high volume program, and of course the athletes, they can't do it for more than a short period of time, or maybe they just survive as opposed to thrive. But as my thesis is that this hasn't happened in triathlon. In fact, we're going the other direction still, and people don't want to hear the message of volume matters, chronic load matters, and there are other factors. Of course, the risk of injury, with running is of course going to be higher than just cycling. But it's very interesting because I watched, and there's a lot of people discussing this now. It's like, what's changed in cycling? Why are there so many young riders going so fast? And I watched a video from a colleague of yours in the cycling world, Jaron Swart, who worked for UAE, and he had a whole bunch of things. It was on GCN, interesting video, and he had a whole bunch of things: monitoring, off-season training, strength training, nutrition, as you mentioned. But didn't touch on this in chronic load model, which I thought was very interesting that you're talking about today, because that is a fundamental change, and I'm not sure that's received in triathlon. And I know, I don't know what every country and every coach is doing, but my observations is that we are not in that space, and I often talk about, lots of triathletes are interested in what the Norwegians are doing, but what they seem to want to model is more the intensity control than the 30 hours a week for 10 years. It's very interesting. I mean, what are your thoughts on how this might apply to triathlon? Like what either your own observations, or is there something that's different about triathlon, or is this just not caught on, or is it maybe not applicable? What do you think?
Honestly, I think triathlon has a major problem at the moment with evidence base, and I think that's the biggest difference in cycling, where you just have these strong groups, even affiliated to strong university research, where there's just really good groups working together and collaborating and trying to move on cycling. I've not seen in triathlon any real approach from different groups to actually move the sport forward. So that's why, totally right, you feel like triathlon is just stumbling away, and just kind of do whatever they do, or never really get out of the comfort zone, or ask some really interesting questions like you had before, influence of durability in triathlon. I've never seen any really convincing work. I mean, there's always like one or two studies in a year, but then very often they're underpowered, they're not really representative. I understand it that in cycling it's a lot easier because you have access to a 25 man world tour roster team. You know, that's obviously a dream. But why should it not be possible in triathlon? Then you just got to seek for more collaboration. And I started because I consult a bit in triathlon now again, because it's just been my sport, and I worked with a few Austrian triathletes now, and one of them is Jeppe Kendall, who was an Olympian in Paris, and he had quite a rough intro, but he made the qualification through a very challenging year, and he's been known as a quite good bike rider. But when I look at his power profile from these World Series racing, this is like, a cyclist is just doing endurance on it. It's like 280, 285 watt rolling average. The bike courses are not really challenging. You have a lot of acceleration, that's true, but it's like, what I found, it's like the first phase is really important. You have this high power output demand after the first transition, and you need to be able to go really deep for 2 to 3 minutes. I think this is where the whole race is decided, almost pre-decided, and then they just roll along and wait for the run. And I think at the moment, unless Hayden Wild takes some initiative as they did in Abu Dhabi and tried to bridge, but even then, they were 3 away, and Jeppe and Westermann, and then they got called again. It's boring, it's pretty boring, and there's not much action. And I think World Triathlon needs either to think about adding a bit more course demands to the course, that you actually see a bit more action. But you see in PTO racing as well, like I like and love triathlon, but who is watching riders 80k on a motorcycling track or something? It's just boring. And I think this is where the sport just misses innovation in terms of the course demands. Just look at cycling, and cycling lives from. Imagine you do this World Tour cycling all on a racetrack. No one is interested. Mm-hmm. It lives through the course demands, and I think why should it not be possible in triathlon to be a bit more innovative about those course demands, because that would challenge the training approach a lot. I think now nothing changes because athlete can get away with it. So it actually the racing would dictate also the training, and I think it's just the adaptation to the least work required. So the minimalist approach, and I think in triathlon you see a lot of minimalist approach in the training, and especially on short course. I think long course is actually with the Ditlevs and stuff and Blumenfeld. I think it's a bit different. They add that real new element, and that's why you see those times in long course actually really going down rapidly. But in short course, like it's literally like even in the Brownlee and Gomez years, it's nothing. Mola years, nothing changed really. So I think they have a bit of an identification problem of how, and I think that also is something sports politically quite important, because if they don't keep the sport attractive, they actually will miss, like public interest, and that could also be that they sacrifice being part of the Olympic program. So I think, so I think with World Triathlon would actually have a lot of work to do to make the sport a bit more attractive again.
It's been many years since we had that race in Kitzbühel when they went up the
exactly the upper race, climb. Where Alistair won.
And of course we have no races like Strada Bianchi or any cobble classics. We have nothing like this. You make an excellent point, and it just feels, from having observed on the inside a bit more, that the sport is on the back foot, that we're not. We sort of take what we can get rather than design it in a way that's attractive and interesting. We're just happy to have someone want to host the race. And even the Abu Dhabi race this year, that was on a different course on this island than the F1 track. And it felt like it was difficult for them just to get to organize it, rather than let's make it the most interesting possible, or that's a whole other topic of the direction of the sport.
No, but you're totally right. I think when we are with triathlon now, actually just I can now compare it really well with cycling. And the problem in triathlon, what you also have is like never ever in the world, like a World Cup, which is considered as a 1-point pro race, would be cancelled 2 months before it actually would happen. So now in April, this whole calendar changes again because the World Cups in South America don't take place because, and again, like the logic, they go, even when you talk about an environmental friendly sport, they go from east to west to mid to back and forth. It's all over the place. In cycling, you have those clear phases. You have your Aussie summer, then you go through UAE, you race around Saudi, Oman, then you go to Europe with the classics, then it's basically epicenter in Europe. Then in September, you go over to Quebec and have Montreal and the US, Maryland, and then you have World somewhere. But it's super aligned. And then, it helps also to prioritize. In triathlon, it's absolutely a mess with where you have to go. And I think that also is something that really limits involvement in training. Because if you look at the athletes, what they can train during like peak competition phases, and it's literally, you cannot get high volumes in because they either traveling, racing, or recover. And I think even if only the best in the world, like a Yi or Wild or etc., I think they can just select those races they want to do. But let's take those really spot fighters to get Olympic qualification and so on. They need to go from south to east to west, whatever, to just chase those points each race. And I think this is where the sport is not in a good place.
It has a huge impact, as you said, the international travel across many time zones and the ability to do the training and certainly the result, the one strategy that some athletes have used is to skip races in order to train.
Yes.
Which of course then has the impact of, well, that's not the best for the sport either. If the best athletes are not turning up sometimes, and that in order to train, everyone, the quality of the product suffers. But I want to come back to your point on the data sharing, because I think that's very interesting in triathlon, and I tend to agree on reflection. And it's a very contentious issue, I could say, in triathlon from my experience. And maybe it shows the fragmented nature of the sport. And I know various countries, they want to have access to, say, the athletes' training peaks. And they're not teams, of course, like you're talking about. So they're not a collection of a team that they can sort of require that. Inevitably, we have trust issues in the sport of like, is it in the athlete's interest? Can you show that it's in the athlete's interest to share the data with the organization? You have athletes who are part of federation programs and then other athletes who are not. And it's like that sort of sharing kind of again, it's about trust. It's about, is it in the athlete's interest? I know Australia was going through a big project of trying to link training peaks to their athlete management system, the AMS, which is not the best piece of software. I don't know if you've come across this, and that was a huge battle. And I understand both sides of it. I understand of like, in order to generate and look at data and create insight that could move the sport forward, you need access to that. But these organizations have a lot of work to do to build trust and to build the sense that, well, there's something in it for that athlete, that it's not just using their data for a bigger purpose. And some of the insights that come out of what was able to be gathered around training loads around injury was interesting. I mean, it sort of maybe confirmed, the big insight that I recall was the incidence of lower leg running injuries is the highest in the first part of the training phase, like early on, which is maybe a coaching insight that you might know with some experience, but equally it's good to have that sort of validated, and then also other coaches could think about that and apply that. But from a training point of view, really miles behind cycling from the sounds of, like, from a data point of view. There's just, I don't know if anyone is doing what you're talking about in cycling. I don't know if that exists in triathlon, if anyone is able to produce that kind of longitudinal study or even understanding, the quality and the chronic load, that does seem to be far behind.
I mean, the design would be quite easy. You take those you take those files from a competition, and you can, those who have power meters, this is even not that quite populated in triathlon either. Like not even everyone who competes in the World Series or World Cup has a power meter on their bike, which could blow my mind. This is not like you could not imagine that in cycling. But if you would, for example, if you would need to design a project to at least answer that, okay, influence of pre-bike on running, that's actually quite simple. You quantify the bike leg, you look at the work distribution, at the acceleration parts and this, and you correlate that to the running performance and then the running splits. And then there you go. But in order to answer that properly, you would need to have the best and also the worst, because then you get the heterogeneity in your data set. If you only have those small sample sizes of 5, 6, you get a trend, but you don't get like a really good conclusion. And then you could do this on a World Series level, you could do this on a World Cup level, you could do this on a Continental Cup level, and you can add a sex difference as well, a gender difference. And that would be quite a powerful study in triathlon that would actually look and say, wow, in the World Series, we see this massive impact on the bike, which this is like, okay, I'm talking about an anecdote and observation here, but I tell you my anecdotes quite openly and to the whole public, and maybe there is a research group who finds interesting coming out of this podcast to actually go for it. But I tell you what, the World Series, there is 100% a very, very strong impact on the intensity on the bike you spend to the running performance, because if you want to be good in the World Series, you need to be a good bike handler and you need to be a good bike rider. The lower you got in terms of the quality of field factor or even the competition level, the smaller is the influence of the bike on the subsequent running performance. And I remember Kitzbühel. This is my home race. And if you look at it, and I've been also part when it was still a World Series race, and then now it's just has been reduced to a European Cup. And if you just look now, this bike is no longer decisive of anything, because they just wait until they all together, 40 people, arrive at the T2 and they just go all for a 5 kilometer blowout, And so I think the lower ranked the races are, the less has the bike element or the bike portion and influence on the subsequent running performance. The higher you get from, grand finals, world championships, Olympics, the higher is the impact on the bike. And I would say on the man, and not stronger than on the woman. That's kind of just, maybe if you disagree, but that's just my observation from when,
No, I absolutely agree. And it has an interesting implication for coaching, because at junior and young levels in the circuit, the athletes they tend to train to the demands of those events that have a lower demand of the bike. And so you end up with this interesting sort of trend as athletes are successful at young ages. They don't necessarily need that ability on the bike. And yet then some become exposed as they move up that they haven't actually done the work on the bike. And then suddenly the bike is very hard. And now they're potentially years behind in terms of chronic load or skills or work. Because as a junior, if you're a good swimmer runner, you're probably going to be pretty successful. And U23, it depends. It's not a deep category in triathlon. And as you say, Conti Cups, World Cups, usually not that demanding. And now World Series can be very demanding, depending how your level of swimming. And as you say, the first lap of the
Yokohama. Yeah, Yokohama is a really good course, or even, you have a few. Sunderland was a really hard course at that time. And I think there are some World Cups as well. I think, is it Summit? Now, for example, Carlsbad would actually be a really interesting World Series race this year. Because Carlsbad bike courses, I would say, one of the most challenging ones, And there you definitely need a really, really good bike, as you say, bike engine room. Because essentially it's like on the bike, most athletes, and that's exactly what you said, if you don't have the chronic exposure, the issue you will run down is because it's on or off, on or off. So if you don't have like a good work capacity, aerobic capacity to absorb all the acceleration, you massively go always in the red, like really deep in the red. And then in combination, very often those athletes have really bad bike handling skills. There's a couple of things. When you look at those race demands in triathlon, there's a lot of U-turns, a lot of 180 degrees acceleration. The problem is if you have really bad aerobic capacity, you enter those U-turns almost in the last third position, And then this massive acceleration hits you again and again and again. So you need to have this high aerobic capacity to actually position well in the bunch, to also don't have really, really high acceleration, So there's a huge tactical component as well. And you just see with those bad bike handlers plus bad aerobic capacity, they need to have these 850 watt peaks for the acceleration part, which then just puts them in a hole for the rest of the competition. And that's exactly what aligns with you. If you look at the fresh running splits, they almost run a sub 14 minute on the 5K, but they could only do close to 15 minutes or something in the subsequent run when they have been under the pump.
Indeed, and we have a huge variability in the quality of running off the bike versus what you might expect, just for the reason you say. You see athletes doing all kinds of fantastic run sessions, then arrive at races and you see them almost jogging the run. They're not able to deliver what you think that they would be capable of for exactly the reasons you're describing. And the other factor of that, of course, is many athletes that don't have a cycling background, there's this psychological element to the tactics that's very interesting, and it's very challenging as a coaching point of overcoming, fear, overcoming just the lack of experience in proximity to others. So, if you're fearful, you ride at the back because you think you have more space. But of course, even rationally, these athletes, they know it's going to make them harder for them, for the slingshot of it. Having to accelerate more, and yet it's still a really challenging point to overcome for some athletes because they just don't have experience riding in proximity to others. They become fearful. Maybe they've fallen off before. That's a whole other rabbit hole of coaching. It shows it's not just physiology, but it is a holistic point of view of how do you optimize triathlon performance and integrate confidence and skills together. But yeah, that's a fascinating point. But we started to talk about mentioned Australia a little bit because we digressed immediately in this conversation. But your current roles, so you are working for Cycling Australia or Australia Cycling. I don't. They changed the name recently, but you also work for Aus Cycling. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the biggest fan of how the sports are changing to Aus Triathlon, Aus Cycling. But in any case, But you also work for Jayco Alula, is that right? Let's talk about your roles. How did this come about? How did you end up in Australia, and how did you then connect to the cycling team, or which came first? What was your pathway into Australian cycling?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic basically pretty much finished, and Australia was quite neglecting on international experts coming to the country at that time. They pretty much, locked it down for any international expert to arrive. And honestly, after all the university work I did, and I went on and had on another year in postdoc, I said, wow, I need to have a change. I need to break out, and I need to see something different. It's just always been stuck in Austria, and also know the culture here, and people are just always making excuses and stuff. I just had enough of this environment, and I just had to break out. And I said, well, I need to go away. And then funnily, I was only thinking about that. And then Jamie Stanley messaged me and saying, hey, Peter, there becomes a position available with Aus Cycling as an endurance training scientist. I think you would be good to apply for. It was basically after the Tokyo Olympics, and I said, well, clearly I don't have anything to lose. Let's just go for it. And then didn't have really small chances of making it, given it was a pretty international role, and I didn't at that time have much international experience other than working a bit with some World Tour teams in collaboration projects and the cycling team in Austria. But I think they were quite interested in that innovative approach of my research. So I think that helped me at that time to really go for it. And they came up and wanted to start with me. So I went through all the administration in Australia to actually come to the country and work. And I was actually starting as the endurance training scientist for Commonwealth Games in 2022, then Super Worlds in Glasgow, and then obviously as the highlight of the end of my contract was in 2024 the Olympics in Paris, and I was basically working with the track endurance team, but also with the road cyclists. So I had a joint role for both men and women. Part of it was performance support, to just being basically an applied physiologist, making sure lab testing, field testing, warm-ups, cool-downs, cooling, heat preparation, altitude preparations, all you can imagine from performance support. But then I also ended up obviously coaching athletes individually. And one of those athletes, or the majority of those athletes, also were seconded to the World Tour team, Jayco Alula. And there is a strong connection between Aus Cycling, which is the company behind Jayco Alula, as they are an Australian licensed World Tour team. And most of the staff who went through the Aus Cycling team, national team, ended up working also for Jayco. So it was just clear that both parties actually wanted to make a joint project out of it for collaboration. So, and then my role was actually part of it. There were other parts of that collaboration, or are parts of that collaboration, but I mean, having access to that shared workspace is really good for both teams, I think, or both organizations. I think a similar approach was also taken for a very long time with Team Sky and British Cycling. That also worked really well. And it's part of it is like having a good development program for young Australian cyclists coming to Europe and race now for the development teams of Greenhead Cycling, which is Hagen's Berman, so Axel Merck's team, and there is a woman Bevo team as well. So it just shaped by the time, I would say, and by the end of the last Olympic cycle, I got some offers from Europe as well. But I decided to say, well, now it's too early to go back to Europe, and I just wanted to prove that we can do similar successful campaign, which will be hard for LA, but that's where I'm at the moment.
Mm. And I mean, was it designed initially to be coaching as well, or did that evolve as you arrived there into that Aus Cycling role?
No, I think part of it was individualized training prescription, they called it in the kind of cover or kind of requirement job descriptions. I think I pretty much, through having that experience before, I pretty much knew how it kind of was made up. But also, the biggest learning I had to take in 2022 was just understanding the culture of Aussies. I think I came in with this classic understanding as like, this is how we train in Europe. We train a lot alone. We train very individualized. And, Aussies were quite different. Like they love their bunch rides and they love their night crits. And I had to be open for this because I had to adapt to that culture change for me as well. It's slightly, I think when they came to Europe and now are then with a European team, then they adopt more to a European training style because they also live in Europe. But in Australia, Australian-based athletes, they have their track Tuesdays, they have their bunch Wednesdays, they have their crit Thursdays, they have their easy day on Friday, the bunch ride on Saturday, and the long endurance ride on Sunday. And this just keeps rotating over and over. And this is just like also culturally quite embedded, and is a big thing because, the pros or the good cyclists meet with the club cyclists and the recreational ones. So in the bunch rides, there are A, B, C, D grades, handicap races all over it. So it was interesting to experience and also adopt to this kind of style of training. So yeah, I had to make a few adjustments to my initial approach.
I think it's interesting. I mean, how do you manage, and I suppose this applies to more athletes who are younger in their development pathway, who are maybe still based in Australia in the Australian summer, whereas obviously European based, they might be there for the tour down under and that, but then back to Europe. But how have you managed sort of that different periodization? Because it is, they're not, as you say, they're not doing long base miles or what they might be doing in Europe. They're not doing that typically, I imagine, anyway, in Australia. Certainly the triathletes are not. I mean, it was one of the challenges that I had to try to understand is, well, they want to race the competitions that are available in the Australian summer, and that's when all of the bunch rides and races are happening. They don't happen at the other times of year.
They love racing. They love racing. They love.
Yeah. In some respects, it's suboptimal from a periodization perspective.
Yeah.
But as you say, how did you face this? How do you sort of see, how do you use what the local, the Australian cycling culture, and there's benefits and there's drawbacks. How do you sort of navigate that after you got the understanding of it? I mean, talk us through from a coaching point of view. What does that look like? How do you adapt? Because presumably, these cyclists, they're going to have targets of where they want to be at their best. And this was the hardest part in triathlon is, the stereotypical Aussie triathlete is brilliant in the first part of the year from March to say May, and then kind of struggles to maintain form when the real European season is going, and maybe at the final, depending. That was always the challenge. How do you create a periodization that functions? I don't know. Maybe in cycling it's different because there are so many different targets. But how do you get your head around this periodization challenge?
Yeah, very good question. It is a challenge for sure, and I think the way we differentiated was domestic athlete versus overseas athletes. I think a domestic athlete, it's normal that Aussie summer is their peak. It's literally, you would say, you're not allowed to be good in European summer for a domestic athlete. That would also not make sense. So given most of the races are there, they also start, they take their off season in August, and then they start basically with their entry in September. Is literally where almost European athletes stop their season. They start already. So they have this kind of September, October, November, really 3 months of solid base work. And then obviously it gets quite busy in December already. And then obviously the peak in January with the nationals and then Tour Down Under and all these, they also lower ranked teams can get very often wildcards for these races. And then it finishes with cadets. And then from a domestic point of view, they might add on like with Oceanias and then track nationals or something. And then they actually do a break by April. And then they rebuild again. Maybe then they go to Asia racing or they come over for June, July. And they do a European block. So that was kind of how the domestic season was looking for those who have not been seconded to like a World Tour team. Those World Tour team athletes like the Sam Wellsfords and the Cal O'Briens and those who have big European seasons ahead of them, is that they basically finish the season doing the China block in the World Tour races with Chongming, and then they do a really good break of 2 to 3 weeks, and they only start by the end of November. So they have like a 4 to 5 week lead into nationals. Like you do like a really short like opener, but you don't even emphasize much on peaking. It's just like, we go as, we chop as we go, then see how nationals go, and then actually Tour Down Under works really well as a next step up, So you actually just don't really trigger them over your summer. I mean, there are some exceptions who are really keen to, like Luke Black, for example. He's always, for him, preparing for summer is like preparing for the Tour de France. But others, who are way more conservative on the Australian summer and just want to get their work done over there as well. And then very often on the way back, they either do UAE tour or they go to Saudi or Oman. So they last race, they always race in Australia as cadets. And then they go straight to Saudi or Oman. So they do the Middle East block. then arrive in Europe and very often have a month to go then. Like they do a rebuild then either in Girona, Andorra, they go to altitude. And then very often those classic Aussie riders, they very often do the classic blocks, they go for the classics. Then like now, one of my boys racing in Paris-Nice or Tirreno, and then they go over to do the full classics. And after Paris-Roubaix, they do a break. And then they build for the May, June, July stage racing blocks. So I think it can be seen as a block, the Australian block, then a rebuild, then the spring block, a rebuild, and then the summer block. So I think this is how the overseas program very much looks like for an Australian-based athlete. But yes, I would tend to agree. The risk is of just that they're hitting the plateau. If it's not well managed, they hit the plateau in April, and then just afterwards it's getting a very, very long season for them if it's not managed well.
Yeah, no, that's a sensible way to manage it, and I think there's certainly some in triathlon have figured out a way, but it's the narrative isn't as logical always as what you just described, just because of when the competitions are, and connecting back to what we said about how triathlon ends up being. It's not joined up as easily, but I mean, it does, make me think of the difference between working for a national federation like you are, and then also working for a world tour team, because some people may not know it. I mean, in triathlon, of course, we don't have something like a world tour team, but it's sort of inverse from triathlon, where the federations are driving so much in triathlon, where your role or the role of Aus Cycling, let's say, or the cycling federations, that the primary responsibility, Olympic Games, Commonwealth Games, World Championships, and then as a different role in the rest of the season and or managing relationships with athletes or performance support. So how does that look? Like, how do you sort of see your role with Aus Cycling, and how that, I mean, it very much makes sense to join it up like you talked about, but what is the difference in those roles that you're doing now, in terms of the connection with the athletes, or practically what does it look like?
Yeah, I think it needs to be well balanced, because obviously you have different highlights. I think that the world tour is just constantly quite busy. Like there is no real breaks in the world tour, given you start racing. I mean, for Jayco, the Australian summer is super important for the sponsors. So delivering a good Australian summer is super key. Like, we are expected to come home with the jerseys for nationals for both men and women. We're supposed to go well in Tour Down Under, at least with a stage win or a good podium. And then, luckily this year we won Cadels with the men's group as well. So I think then it's already like a really good start for a team. But then it goes on, like expectation go higher, especially in Saudi, then the country of the main sponsor. There's always pressure. There's never like a really easy time to ways, now I can actually relax. That's also really not only hard for athletes, but also for staff, because you have to be constantly on. Like this week you had, Paris-Nice, you have Tirreno, and also in Turkey, we got the Nations Cup from the national teams on the track. So it's a pretty busy week to just be, scheduling it all. I think the difference is that in federation, you have these stronger recovery phases, especially after the Olympics. It's just kind of people take time, they do their debriefs, they go on holiday, they go on leave. This is not possible in World Tour. Like in World Tour, you got to be available. Even when you are on leave, you have to do 1 hour of administration in the morning. You got to respond to the directors. You got to respond to your riders. You got to check the training. You got to respond to emails. And I would say in very often in federation, it's a bit more laissez-faire in areas. But then when you go down more to key qualification periods of Worlds, so Olympics last year was manic. Like the 2-3 months leading into the Olympics was a very, very high workload from a federation perspective as well. So I think federation work is more phase dependent, whereas World Tour is just constantly on. And you got to learn how to take breaks for yourself as well, because I think it's pretty open that there's high burnout risk in World Tour as well. Like, just be over it, And I think it's quite important to also be open about this, because most staff is not comfortable talking about it. But this constant element of being on and responding and delivering can also be quite exhaustive, and also can take the joy off why you do it. So yeah, it's definitely requires a well balance.
I mean, that it's a big issue, I think, in high performance, isn't it, across both Olympics and professional, as you're talking about, in that if you don't look after yourself, you end up, you see a lot of turnover in some of these organizations. And of course, what you lose the institutional knowledge if people leave, they take, the knowledge with them. How are you thinking about that? How are you looking after yourself, or what, finding enough time to recuperate? Is it an ongoing discovery, or do you have some tactics that you use to try to keep your energy and focus? What's your approach there?
Yeah, I think I learned through exposure. I would say I was pretty bad at the beginning. I was not aware of why you have to take breaks, because I thought, oh no, I have to be on, I have to deliver. You also want to show that you're worth, the trust they put in you, and you want to just show what you can do. And I was obviously quite going in with high energy and a lot of investment and so on. But pretty soon hit the deck and said, well, I cannot keep up with this rate. And then it takes a time of, the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I like to describe the Dunning-Kruger effect in the way of you achieve wisdom and knowledge. And I came in and was on Mount Stupidity, and then I had to go through the low phases of the hard times. And then you go back to excellence, but slowly. And I think I just hit that kind of, in 2024, I probably hit the really bottom. And now I feel like this small progression in terms of achieving excellence, which will probably, hopefully, never end. But as you said, I think that the most important thing is prioritizing time away from all this, which is just, I learned to just switch off my mobile phone at a different, after a certain period of time. And also be really good in evaluating if this needs now an immediate action or not. Because if it becomes, we're humans, if it becomes a habit that they always can reach you, they take use of it. It's just normal.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I had athletes that just said, they called me and said, I'm doing my workout. What cadence should I write this? And, I said, you should do this at this. And I just said, well, I like to quote Confucius now. If a clown walks into a palace, he does not become king, but the palace turns into a circus. And this is just the best description of what you do. Is like, I also call it monkey business. If you give bananas, you become monkeys. So I think there needs to be a self-determination and a self-initiative from an athlete about this training. And it's also okay for you to not respond within, an hour. I think I always respond within 24 hours, but I had to learn to let go and not always be available. That was the biggest learning. And yes, my phone actually got significantly more silent. And I think that the other thing was just, spending exercising, doing a lot in the nature, like just be away from the blue light, computer, etc. Spend time with family and just with your loved ones. I think that's the most important thing. And I think this is really re-energizing. And also, just don't talk about your job. I used to love to talk about cycling and all this, and it's so exhaustive, especially when you talk to people. There's no offense, but this is so niche what we're talking about in high performance sport, that people who don't work in high performance sport, they cannot really follow. And it's not their fault, but it's just, for me, then it might sound arrogant, it's a waste of time to talk about it, and I just stop talking. And like when people want to say, hey, how are you? And then you say, fine. And then they just about to go into the cycling topic or high performance, look at that, and I just try to have a normal conversation with people not in this industry. And this helps a lot, just not talk about the job the whole time. I also stopped, for example, I was so meticulous about my own data, power meter data. I had all the Neos, the Moxie, everything you could imagine. I tried on my own. Now I don't even use it. Okay, I use a GPS for a watch for my Strava, but I don't use a power meter, heart rate, nothing, because it's just, I don't want to see any data from my own, because you work with data day to day. You just don't need this anymore. And so I think, that is kind of a bit of my journey, I would say, in trying to realize where you are and what you need, and look after your well-being. And actually having conversation like we have now, this is really good to reflect on it. So talking to peers or talking to, people in a similar environment than you is really good, because you feel understood, you exchange, you interact. I think that's also quite valuable. That's why I actually like doing this kind of podcast, to just exchange views and the ideas.
You have a lot of wisdom there. I think the things that resonated with me are setting boundaries early on. If you can give advice to a young practitioner or coach, and of course, it's not that you don't want to be available and help. We all do. But in the long-term perspective, if you are, responding to texts at night, or very early in the morning, or it's perhaps not sustainable in the long term. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which a senior athlete that I work with also recently mentioned this, that he liked to have conversations not about triathlon, because it seems like he was just always, everyone wants to talk about triathlon, and of course, it stops you from being able to switch off if that's the topic all the time. You can't compartmentalize. In that sense, it just bleeds into everyday life. So both very very wise and hard won through experience, but because of course so many people with so much experience and value to add can end up burnt out and unable to continue. And I think it's the story of high performance is tremendous experience that just gets lost because of burnout, because of either not being able to look after yourself. And and I think maybe not all athletes understand this, but being in performance support as a coach, it's a profession of giving energy to others. It's supporting. It's often it feels that it's going in one direction. Your energy is out, and that has a cost, doesn't it? And you have to be able to recharge yourself. And it's not that the athletes don't appreciate the work you do, but you don't get the same thing back from them that you give out.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
exactly. And that probably I realized that after the Olympics, like it's quite an ego world. Like it's quite an egocentric world, and the athletes need to be egocentric, like as a positive attribute, in order to maximize their full potential. But what happens is, as a staff, you're so replaceable, so no one is waiting for you. That's what I also realized. Like, if it's not me, then it comes the next. So that's why that helps me. It's like, well, everyone is replaceable, and it's just like, if it's not you, it's the next one. And this is also like quite a superficial world we are operating in, and athletes can be quite superficial at some point, where you actually expect, well, we achieved something really great together, and you don't even get a thank you message, or the little things, like I get a lot of thank you message from athletes, but for some where you have invested a lot, and it's not about the money here, but it's about just the thank you and the appreciation of what you've done. If you don't get this can actually really, really hurt.
Mm-hmm.
And hurt for the future as well. And so I just realized by the time, and I had some experiences as well, I was always very open to give, very open to interact, and never really judge my time on it. But if you never get back a thank you or an appreciation, or, then you think about, next time maybe I should not give away so much. So yeah, that was a tough learning for me as well, that it's actually, or understand that it's actually quite a superficial world. And yeah, as I said before, it seems like sometimes you are in a circus.
No, that really resonates, Peter. I think, I mean, some relationships feel more like a partnership. Others, it's a bit more transactional. You know, we're doing a job, and when we're not seen as valuable anymore, then people move on. And also everyone is replaceable. I mean, there's something you inevitably learn in working life, that no matter how good you think you are, everybody is replaceable. And it doesn't mean that your skills or value is necessarily replaceable, but in these organizations, they have turnover. There's all different reasons why. It can be political. It can be, change of leadership. I mean, we see this, of course, in professional sports, in football. The whole staff changes when a manager goes. But no, really valuable high level insight. That's hard won from the sounds of things. And it's a good point to finish up. I mean, there was so much more we could have discussed. I had a number of topics and research, but I always like to reach the high level view on things. That's sort of where I end up, and I think where we finish there is really sums up so much of your experience and journey through from a student to a practitioner at the coalface. So maybe in the future we'd do another one. We'd talk about some of these further research projects that are out there that could be interesting and applicable. But if people want to follow you, you're not a huge social media guy. I see you've got
That's also what I learned. I don't interact on like I very often like to just keep in silence and talk to people like on the phone or through like a proper video chat. I'm not on Instagram. I'm using pseudo names on Twitter, PL, and or X. I actually reduced activity on X just because of these general trends what we see with this platform and the people involved there. So I'm actually not even thinking if I actually add something on this platform. Yeah, otherwise I'm on ResearchGate, PubMed. You can all find my research. I'm in a few on Spotify podcasts. But yeah, I think those people who are interested, they find out my contact, how they can reach me. And I think that's also a bit of self-protection. I just don't think that the work I do needs to be resonating much on social media, because I think it's quite trustful work. It's work that athletes don't always want to talk about publicly. It's consultation. It's about sensitive information, also about competing interests. So I don't think that I need a place to be in social media. And there's so many opinionated people anyway that it's hard to make a difference there. It's just like a rabbit hole. So I just gave up on this. I let this should not. I always just think like when I read something like of others where just head banging, it's just like, yeah, let the clowns be clowns and don't interact. Sometimes I really want, like I'm just so close to typing, but I just say, yeah, no, the clowns be clowns and don't waste energy on this.
Well, that's a wise approach, Peter. I think it is such a time suck of opportunity. Where do you want to spend your time? Time and attention are the most valuable currencies, aren't they? And you talked at the very beginning about having time in the pandemic to reflect on how influential that was. And I think creating time to think about what you're doing and to not get distracted. I mean, I'm a big fan of Cal Newport's work on time and attention and where we spend our energy, and that being so valuable in the performance space of being able to connect the dots and what you see and that personal reflection, critical reflection. That said, you've done some other interesting interviews, and we'll link to those, and your ResearchGate, which has a whole bunch of stuff to dig into there in terms of articles.
Yeah, but it's still not enough to get my Kardashian index down. So I either need to quit my Twitter followers, or because the papers are not so, actually quite as 30 plus papers already. But yeah, just the Kardashian is overweighted still.
Well, thanks very much. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed and appreciate your sharing, and look forward to a future opportunity.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, that was a great discussion with Peter. I really found the insight in how cyclists have been training differently since the pandemic, something unique that I hadn't heard before, and that change of approach. And really makes me think of how that may or may not apply to triathlon and why that may or may not be happening. So if you found this discussion valuable with Peter, check out his ResearchGate link and previous interviews in the show notes for more. Leave us a question or comment about what you took away from this interview. And finally, support the podcast by signing up for the Real Coaching Substack, resubscribing and leaving comments, reviews, sharing this interview with somebody who might find it valuable. That's our model, value for value.